everyone, welcome to the Higher Points podcast. Nick Sauer is here in the studio with my buddy Nate Hyatt as usual, and we have Bill Howard back on the show. If you don't know who Bill is, he was back on episode 38 where we talked about some of his stories, some of his leadership and time in law enforcement where he retired as a major. Well, we have him back on because the one of the hot button issues was the Uvalde school shooting, or the Robb Elementary School shooting down in Texas, and kind of like to me it seems a little bit like it's the modern day Columbine in the sense of the lessons learned and the things that we need to make sure that we're doing better in the law enforcement community, and just kind of discuss some of the leadership there, stuff like that. And it's always going to be interesting to kind of catch, like, I'm a street level officer, but to also see maybe some of also his supervisory side. Like I said, he retired out as a major, so to see his viewpoint from that kind of 30,000 foot view of maybe even how he would have done things differently or something like that. So he is with us remotely. He hasn't traveled back to where we could find a time where we could all get together. So we're meeting together on Google Meet, and we're going to get him going. So how you doing today, Bill?
Great. Good to be with you, Nick and Nate. Nick and Nate's Excellent Adventures.
Yeah. There's the alternate podcast title if things don't work out. So you just want to kind of give a brief description of who you are, where you came from, and everything like that, just for those that maybe haven't listened to episode 38 yet?
Be glad to. My name is Bill Howard. I worked in law enforcement. Well, I'm still in law enforcement about 40 years now. 36 years at Kansas City, Kansas Police Department, where I served from a cadet at the age of 18. I came on in 1982 at the age of 18, and I served there until I retired in 2018. And I retired as a major. And part of my duties as a major was I was a commander over the SWAT team, Special Operations Unit, and I was never a sergeant in that unit. I was never a captain in that unit, but I was an operator in that unit back in the early 90s for 3 years. So I was a point man and a cover man on an entry team, and we had a 10-man team, and we did a multitude of tasks. Our primary task was drug raids. And if you remember the early 90s, there was a lot of crack cocaine. So we did a lot of training. And I'd been to gun sight several times to train in Prescott, Arizona. And went there with some SWAT team members. I also trained at Thunder Ranch. And as a commander, I went to some training in Salt Lake City, Utah, where we went to the NTOA National Convention and spent a week there training with those guys. So have a little bit of experience in special operations, but by no means am I the guru. I've just spent time both as an operator and in a command post. So, for what we're going to talk about today, and the bulk of this, the lion's share of this is going to be about that. I just want to put those qualifiers out there.
Yeah. So just kind of at least where I'm getting my information from, and I don't know if you are from different sources, Bill, but like I don't really like the idea of watching CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, etc. when those things are going on, and trying to learn anything or make any type of a judgment or anything based on those news reports, because they're just trying to get whatever soundbite they can to get people to watch them more, to sell more ad space, and they don't really fact check much of anything. So for me, the Texas House Committee put out an investigative committee report on that, and that was kind of what led me to read that whole thing, which you heard me mention a little bit on the podcast previously. It's 82 pages long, and that's kind of where I got my information from. And so the things that I'm going to be talking about typically are going to be the information that I got from that report today.
Okay, so just to clarify, we're talking about Robb Elementary.
Yes.
And we're talking about Uvalde, Texas. That's going to be the lion's share of the discussion today.
Yeah.
As I understand it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so just to give you a little background on what I've watched and learned about the situation, I've watched the hallway security cameras. I've watched Sergeant Daniel Coronado's body cam and Officer Mendoza's body cam. I've watched and reviewed the commentary from Jocko Willink, Michael Glover from Fieldcraft Survival, a multitude of news stories. I've probably watched over 25 news stories. And I've gathered information both from the report you mentioned and from the alert report from Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training.
I didn't even know that one was out. I would love to get a copy of that and read that, because they're the de facto.
Actually, I sent that to you, but for whatever reason, it wouldn't come across as a text, so I sent it to you through an email as well.
Okay.
But I have it right here in front of me.
Gotcha.
I could try to email it to you if you're interested.
Well, so just to give, I guess, a little bit of background on from what the investigative committee said happened was essentially you kind of had a single parent household, a troubled young man who really didn't have a whole lot of disciplinary issues in school. Your typical small run-in things that kids get, but nothing that really made huge, like...
No big red flags.
Like red flags, at least from the Texas House Committee point of
view.
Yeah,
there was red flags.
Well, right. But I'm saying as far as like there was in the like the messages that he was sending friends and things like that. But I'm talking from the school's perspective. Like he was truant, correct? He had some truancy issues.
Right.
But as far as like he'd never like outright threatened and said like I'm going to shoot the school up or anything like those things that people would like expect to see, right? That you see from the old, like from other news reports?
I don't know a lot about him. I just know that on social media, his nickname was actually the school shooter because they had already typecast him as a school shooter because he had some suicidal ideations and he'd even mentioned it on some of his social networking. However, and in the games he was playing. However, my understanding about him is that he was talking to people on different continents.
Yes, right.
And it wasn't even local people he was chatting with.
Yeah, I agree with that. And so, and he'd been trying to he wasn't old enough to purchase firearms for a long time while he was having a lot of this communication and a lot of this ideation. He tried to get family members to buy him firearms, which they had said no. So fast forward, he's old enough to purchase these firearms. He kind of he shoots grandmother, correct, before he goes to the school. He'd moved out from mom because him and mom were having issues, which I thought was interesting, Bill, because in the last podcast you talked about the elephants and the bull elephants being removed from the herd, and that moms can only control them essentially for so long. So it was kind of like that same situation in this. He moves out, moves in with grandma, gets the guns. She is like wanting to take his cell phone away. He shoots her and then proceeds to the school from there.
Yes.
So I guess, Bill, you've done a whole lot more research on this than I have. So from there, I guess I'll kind of let you take it away and then we can just kind of discuss from there.
Okay, like I said, I had retired from Kansas City, Kansas Police Department in 2018, but in 2019 I went back to work, and I'm currently working at a campus as a campus officer at a junior college in Kansas, and and I just have to say that this junior college that I'm at, which I really don't want to mention right now, but the junior college I'm at is way, way more prepared for that situation. And they have so many other safeguards that are in place to address this and or prevent it. And so I also spoke to my nephew who works in Texas. He's a Texas law dog. And he knows some of the officers that were at the scene. So maybe I can clear up some of the issues from the perspective of, what the public knows versus what law enforcement is talking about. So hopefully we can clear that up today. So what I know is that Uvalde, Texas is a border town, population about 16,500. They have a small police department of about 28 officers. They have a dedicated police department to the school district with about, I want to say 6 officers is what I was told. but I didn't actually look that up. They have a Chief Arredondo, and we're going to talk about him today. Uvalde is located about 80 miles west of downtown San Antonio, about 55 miles east of the Mexican border. And the incident involving Robb Elementary, there were 19 children murdered and 2 teachers were murdered. And I believe there were 17 additional people injured in that incident. The 2 of them were police officers, right? So I'm assuming and presuming that you and everybody listening has watched at least the hallway video and has made their own presumptions up to this point, right?
Yeah, pretty easy to do.
Yeah, let me give you a little bit of background on the school itself. They had been through alerts training or Alice training at the school. They knew the protocol and they were addressing the protocol. The shooter shot his grandmother in the face. He drove to the school. He crashed in a ravine. He got out of his vehicle and 2 men approached him from a nearby funeral parlor and he shot at them. Those guys took off running. They were uninjured, but the officers were already en route because I think they were en route to the shooting at his house. And then they were notified of this crash. There was an officer already en route. He gets out of his vehicle. He's got a grab bag of ammo, and he's got a rifle, .223, I believe. And after he shoots at these 2 people, he climbs out of the ravine and he starts walking towards a school. And he makes it onto the school ground. And he's passed by a police officer who's racing to the scene. Police officer doesn't notice him. And as I understand it, he starts firing shots into the school from outside. There were 24 rounds expended outside towards the school, going into the classroom that he ended up attacking. Some of the rounds went into the classroom he ended up attacking. So there had been a teacher in the back of the school who watched him arrive, who kicked the rock out, who shut the doors, what they're claiming. She initiated the lockdown process and they were calling the police, telling the police what was going on. So all this was live, right? So he makes it into the school. There are police officers already on the scene. Supposedly, one officer had him in his sights, asked permission to shoot the suspect who'd already fired on the school. So you could presume that he had the right guy. Now that story changed later that that was actually a teacher dressed just like the suspect. And we can verify that through crossing videos or whatever. So he was 150 yards out and he misidentifies the shooter as a teacher. He waits for permission to shoot the shooter, who he later says, nope, that wasn't the shooter. That was just a teacher. And, we made a wise decision not to shoot that person before they went inside. That is suspect to me. I would focus on that if I were investigating this, because he was positive at the time he had the shooter in his sights, and later he says no, that wasn't the shooter. It ended up being somebody else according to all the camera views that they looked at. I'm not privy to the camera views, but the house seems to be satisfied with that answer, and so does the Texas Department of Public Safety. They seem to be satisfied with that answer from their review of it. But let's be clear, there were officers on the scene before he made it in the building, right?
Right.
Now, this is where the fog of war comes in. So if you're not used to, as a police officer, getting that adrenaline dump, and you get one suddenly out of nowhere, you're going to get tunnel vision. And if you don't breathe through that, you're going to end up suffering some of the side effects of adrenaline, especially a mad rush of adrenaline, right? So I can understand how the officers could drive past the suspect.
Yeah, I
They
agree.
really don't probably have a great description of him yet. He's got long hair. He probably looks like a girl. I don't know. But we can all safely say and admit that if we'd have caught him on the outside of that building, this never would have happened. Right?
Yeah, I would agree.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I would say, and I don't know, Texas, from what I say, I have a friend that is also a Texas law enforcement officer, and they do a pretty tremendous amount of training as a state in general. I mean, their standards are decently high. They are a well-trained, well-equipped, well-paid police force. And I'm curious of, like, also what the question is, because if he had like a LVPO, the limited, or LPVO, the limited power variable optics that you put on top of rifles these days that are like the 1-4s, or if he just had a red dot, or if he just had open sights of, like what that shot would have looked like.
He had iron sights, Nick. I think he had iron sights.
And
I mean, if you look at the rifles that they were carrying, most of them had iron sights.
Yeah, and so making a 150-yard shot is very doable. I mean, like that's no problem with a 223 style rifle. But so I think maybe that's probably why. And again, I'm making inferences here. Why they were probably satisfied with that answer, because it is 150 yards, and then in the fog of war, and in that moment of making that decision, that probably was why they were willing to give that benefit of the doubt to that officer.
How do you train a guy for that? The breathing through, your adrenaline, that kind of thing. Is that something you can really train?
Yeah, it is something I've been trained on.
Athletes are more used to it than people who are non-athletes, which is probably a reason why law enforcement traditionally takes athletes or former athletes, and they traditionally take people who've been in the military, because they're used to the adrenaline dump and they know how to breathe through it. In a pursuit is a great example of that, and that's why they have us talking during a pursuit, a car chase, because you're breathing, and as long as you're breathing to talk, you're going to slow down your heart rate, and you're going to get more oxygen to your brain. Yeah. And you're going to be visually better and more capable of driving.
Well, and we also get trained in training of that stress inoculation, to where we get put into stressful situations in training so that you're more used to responding to things like that. That it's not that shock to the system as much as it would be if you weren't used to it. Yeah. So that's another way. So if we'd I didn't mean to interrupt you there if you had something, but so we kind of go to where we could have taken the guy down before he came into the school. When you say the officer went by him, you're talking the officer went by him in a vehicle. It wasn't like he was running on foot and like passed by him shoulder to shoulder.
Raced past the school and raced past the subject shooter.
Right. Okay. In a vehicle. Gotcha.
I kind of want to pause here for a second and talk about the officer who didn't take the shot.
Okay.
Two dynamics were going on there. One, the officer didn't have the confidence to make the shot or take it without permission. And the other dynamic is you had a sergeant who didn't have the confidence in the officer to give him that permission, or in the scenario to give him that permission. Two dynamics going there. Keep that in mind. Because I had a scenario very similar to this. We had a sniper situation in Kansas City, Kansas, where a guy had posted up at a school, coincidentally, and it was late at night, but he was shooting from the ballpark of the school. He'd parked his truck near the ball field, and he climbed out and he started shooting at a house of a girlfriend or an ex-girlfriend, and started shooting into their home. Police arrived, and they determined that the shooting was coming from the ball field, so they drove towards it, and he shot at a police officer. Police officer received shrapnel to the chin. We surrounded the park. We set up a perimeter, and I ended up in the command post that night as a captain. And the subject shooter expelled over 100 rounds, shooting in the direction of law enforcement and the house all night long. We had to vacate the houses while containing him, but eventually our tactical team made its way towards him. Like an hour later, they made their way towards the shooter at the ball field, and the shooter had run out of ammo for his rifle. Now, he had stashed ammo throughout the park area, but officers had kind of corralled him or closed in on him, so he had to take off running. He ran towards his truck, got into his truck, and took off. He was confronted by law enforcement who shot at him. Unfortunately, we had frangible rounds at that time, and none of the rounds penetrated the truck. And all the rounds were buried into the shell of the truck, and the subject made it out of our inner perimeter after shooting over 100 rounds at helicopters and law enforcement. And now we're probably at 1 o'clock in the morning or something of that time frame, and he takes off.
Goodness gracious. I can only imagine.
He makes it out of our inner perimeter, and we had an officer on the outer perimeter, and he was a fairly new officer. And the officer asked me, as I'm running from the command post to the street in the direction where the suspect is driving, the officer's about, 50 yards away from me, and he's got his police car situated in an intersection to stir traffic around that location, right? The subject is driving his truck directly towards the officer, and the officer asked me for permission to engage. Permission to engage a suspect.
Yeah.
Now, why?
I was going to ask the same question.
Why does the officer do that? Because he doesn't have the confidence that if he takes that shot without permission, that he's covered legally. So he's got a commander, he's got someone in authority right there. He wants to get that checkpoint done. Fortunately, in my mind, I know this is a homicidal maniac. We can't allow him to get out of our perimeter. So without question, I just said, take him out. And the officer was a very good shot. He was one of the star shooters at the range in his class, and plugs him right between the eyes. And the guy ends up crashing and dying. And
like in a moving vehicle?
The ramifications for that was that officer was on paid leave, and nobody contacted him telling him, hey, you're good. And so I contacted him and just to check on him, and nobody in the other chain of command had ever checked on him. And he was nervous, as an officer would be, because you've just taken human life. And I just said, hey man, you're good. Don't worry about it. You asked permission. I authorized it. I told you to go ahead. You're following a lawful order. You are covered in so many ways. State laws covering you, but there was still that lack of confidence. I see that happening and playing out, that exact scenario happening and playing out with these officers at the scene. Okay. So I watched the video, and I've heard about this officer not shooting, who I still believe was the suspect. And until I see evidence contradicting that, I believe that he had the suspect in his sights and didn't pull the trigger because of lack of confidence. And the other part is the lack of confidence in that supervisor. Just hang on to that thought, because we're going to talk about that later in the broadcast, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and I'd like to give a story similar to that to help illustrate your point as well. As I kind of have a converse of your story. I talked to a friend of mine that works for a state agency, and he was a precision rifle marksman as well. They had a guy that was going through an apartment building, blowing holes in it. Like, he was literally going from apartment to apartment through walls, because he'd broken his way through the walls. And like, they've got this whole building surrounded. I mean, it was a bad situation. So just to illustrate the point is like my buddy, he had another guy take the shot, and the whole idea behind law enforcement and lethal force is to stop the threat. Once the threat ceases, and once that is the level of force that we can use, we stop the threat, we're done. So another precision rifle marksman had the shot, took it on the guy was down. And he was obviously writhing in pain. He no longer has a weapon in his hand. Well, the other precision rifle marksman radios in saying, I can see him, I've got him in my sights. Well, he gets an order from the command post to shoot. Well, he had the confidence to say no because the threat had ceased. And at that point, he would have been committing a murder on a guy that was just laying there that was no longer a threat because he had already been engaged. So that was the converse to that. And he actually even went into a debrief and said, like, no, I didn't feel right about that. That was not the right thing to do. That's not the way I was trained. And so that's kind of the converse of a little bit of what you're talking about. And I'm assuming what you're getting ready to lead into.
Well, I mean, you make an excellent point. You do not have to follow an unlawful order as a police officer. In fact, you have an ethical duty to do just the opposite of that and not follow it. And maybe the commander who gave the order believed at the time it was a lawful order. It doesn't matter.
Right.
If you believe it to be an unlawful order, you have an obligation to stand down, right?
Yep.
So it sounds like that's what happened. So after reviewing all the videos and stuff, Nick, I have come to the conclusion that Chief Arredondo had gross incompetence and negligence to lead in that situation. So I kind of want to focus a little time on him. He's an interesting guy. He assumes command of that scenario, and he actually goes inside of the building to assume command from inside the building. He goes in there without a radio. Now, that's interesting to me because communications is probably the most important aspect. Really, the breakdown of the situation is because of miscommunication and poor communication, as I see it.
Yep.
Chief Arredondo, if he wanted to be the incident commander, which he was the highest ranking person there, so by default, by NIMS training, he's the incident commander.
Yep.
You got to know what an incident commander's responsibilities are through your training.
Do I know what they are?
I mean, take a stab at it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, essentially, you're basically far enough away from an incident that you're not in danger, that you're able to help make decisions, you're able to help put things together, but you're not close enough that you are in the danger, you're in the hot zone to where you are like an active part of the incident to where you're the boots on the ground, like actually putting things into motion.
Very well put. So he should have withdrew from the school, and he should have set up a command post. And from there, he could do more of a static decision-making rather than being in there to make the dynamic decision-making. He is the highest-ranking official there, and he's also wants to be the trigger man in the situation. Those two don't mesh in these kind of scenarios. Chief Arredondo, he failed in so many ways, but the most important way he failed was by not taking responsibility after the fact for his decisions. He should have fell on the sword. He should have resigned immediately. And he should have taken ownership of that situation because he was the incident commander. And he never did, even now. I mean, my understanding is he never gave a statement to the investigators after the fact. He lawyered up. I think he understands that he made some mistakes. He's just unwilling to accept responsibility for it.
Probably doing some damage control.
He's doing damage control, but because he never stepped down. He should have resigned. He should have surrendered his position because he failed. He should have taken extreme ownership like Jocko Willink would tell you to do. But let's back up before that incident, because I believe that there's poor preparation that had occurred. So if you're the leader of an organization, you should be the one casting the vision. So in order to cast a vision, you have to have a vision of safety, right? You have to be thinking ahead. So he should have thought everything out ahead of time. So let's look at some of the ways he didn't prepare for this situation. He had no keys for any of the doors. They had been rekeyed, and he didn't get a master copy. Well, it's pretty important. Not only did you not have it, but none of your officers had it.
Yep.
I mean, that is a monumental failure. Like, I work at a junior college, and we have the master keys. There's no place on that campus that I don't have access to.
Well,
And
do you feel like there's some fault on the school too, like with?
Oh yeah. First of all, how did it get in your school?
Yeah.
You know the lockdown procedure. So you're telling me you kicked the rock out of the back door, but he still got in? And the other part was, how did he get in room 111? It should have been locked down. Well, room 111, we found out the locking mechanism failed from inside, so they couldn't lock it from the inside, and the teacher complained about it. Students were upset about it. So the faculty knew about it. It's weird that the chief didn't know about it, but everybody knew about it and did nothing about it. And it had been that way for, I'm going to say, weeks.
It'd been that way for enough time that it should have been fixed. It wasn't like it happened that day or something like that, you know?
Right. And the chiefs didn't have any way to communicate other than the cell phone. Well, it turns out that those radios didn't work inside of that school.
Neither one, because they had one for the school district and one to get back to whatever unified dispatch center kind of handled the entire city. So neither radio worked inside the school. Yeah,
and that's a problem. I mean, in the junior college I work at, there are several areas in the college that our radios won't get out. We know where those are. We know not to key our mics in those areas. But the broad scale, we can get out. So that's a problem. I mean, they couldn't communicate from within the school to outside sources. They could hear, they just couldn't transmit. So, I mean, I think if I was the chief, I think I would have tried to correct that. I mean, I think I would have had some comms people come out and say, hey, we need a better system to where we can communicate if anything ever happens in these schools, right? Yeah. But here's the problem that I see with the chief, and this is with all commanders, really. Most commanders are house plants after a certain period of time in their career. They ass plant in a chair every day. And I was one of them. When I got to the level as a major, I had so many responsibilities that involved my computer that you would have thought I was a gamer, because I was on that damn thing all day, only breaking to eat, have coffee, and gossip. I mean, basically, unless I was in a meeting, I was ass planted at my desk. So there's a problem with that, and here's the problem. You are no longer a dynamic decision maker. You're static in your decision making. When you've been out from the field, you've become the house plant or the indoor dog, and you've gotten used to the comforts of home, and you haven't had to face dynamic situations where your own personal life is in peril or those of your men. You shouldn't be making those decisions. That's the biggest failure I see with that chief. He put himself in a situation where it was dynamic. He wasn't used to that. And so what does he do? He calls it a containment. The guy's contained. He calls it a barricade. Well, you know what that is? I feel like that is because of his static decision making. He wants things to return to normal. They call that a normalcy bias, is what they call it psychologically. Our brains have all kinds of biases, and really all that is we make 35,000 decisions a day on a typical day. If we're active and we get out of our homes and we have to go to work, we're making 35,000 decisions a day. And if you're making that many decisions a day, some of those you have to take shortcuts, and that's what we call biases. You have to have those to not have a mental breakdown. So you have to automate so many decisions. And so one of those biases would be if you're not in dynamic situations very often, and then one comes along, you're not prepared. You haven't, what I call, primed yourself effectively to make effective decisions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
So you guys are weightlifters, right? and you prime your muscles. You get the blood flowing to your muscles before you grab them heavyweights, right? You warm up.
I do.
Yep.
Nate doesn't.
Yeah.
Nate, you're going to suffer some shoulder and joint problems.
Oh, hey. He already
have
does. Go ahead.
I cheated because I
Sorry.
heard your other podcast. But, I suffer from them too, Nate, and they will keep you up at night. Trust me.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress. So, what happens if you are a dynamic decision maker? You have a bias towards action, right? Does that make sense?
For
So,
sure.
like you're normally making decisions in the field where there's a threat to you or the community. So you have developed this bias towards action. Now, if you're on a SWAT team, or let's say you're a football player, you guys look like you were football players. Am I right?
Nate was, yeah.
I was.
Okay, congratulations, Nate. You had what they would call a default aggressive. Default aggression is what they would call that, because after being involved in contact sports and having to get aggressive day in and day out in practice, and I don't know if you've ever done any MMA fighting, or if you've done any SWAT training or whatever, you develop what is known as the default aggression. So that's the next level. Like if you're on a special operations, like in the military, Jocko Willink would say you're default aggressive, because you can click over to
That game mode,
homicidal or physical aggression immediately. Like, you don't have to be primed. You're already primed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, your mind doesn't have to jump over to that because you've already visualized it before you showed up that day. Well, that only lasts so long. So if you retire from a unit like that, like Jocko Willink's a commando and all that, but he's been retired now quite a while. But he's kept himself involved in MMA sports, so he's still default aggressive. He still could, tie me up like a pretzel at the grocery store if I pinched his wife or something. You know what I mean? But other guys who have been combat ready have let that lapse, and they're no longer combat ready, and they're not primed, is the way I like to put it. So I have people that I work with that are no longer in law enforcement, no longer in the military, but I work with them at the junior college, and I have great chats with them, and they would tell me about their war stories, right? But you could tell, you could walk up to this person and just take them down. They would not be prepared for you. And, but as opposed to other people who are still in the training and still in the need, still in the doing. So hold on to that thought. That's important. But did you have something, Nick, on that?
I had some follow-up questions after this, whenever we get to that. So, but I'll let you continue for now.
Okay. So with the chief, we've already decided that he's probably a static decision maker. He's probably asked plants every day, like most commanders do, because of their responsibilities are different, right? Did he participate in alerts training? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, that's not in any of the reports I've read.
If he showed up to alert training, did he actually participate in it? Because let me tell you, in 2015, we brought alert training to Kansas City, Kansas, and we all participated in it. From the chief down, my friend. We had sergeants from our TAC unit training us, and it was awesome. Absolutely awesome. But there was a time or two they had to kick me in the ass and tell me to go, because I wasn't moving on the, quote, stimulus. The stimulus being the shots were being fired in the training. They kicked me in the ass a couple of times, and then we did that training all day for 2 days. And if my memory serves me, it might have just been 1 day, but it was awesome training. It was absolutely the best training. Basically, we did it one thorough time. I want to say 1 day with just officers, and the next day we did it with TAC medics, I believe. And we use airsoft pistols, so you were shot at as well. And it was force on force training is what they call that, right? Anyway, my question in my mind would be, did that chief participate in it? Because my guess would be no, because what he did in the hallway was treat this as a static situation, right? So he rifles in here. Let's get the SWAT team in here and let's just hold it down. Make sure he doesn't escape through the roof and all these things. What? The hell are you talking about, dude?
Yep.
Get in there.
It's completely contrary to what we've all been trained since Columbine.
Yeah, well, Columbine training, post-Columbine training, said go in, in a diamond formation.
Yeah, right.
Work training says, you're it, dude.
Yep.
You're first on the scene. You take that shot. You don't need permission. Take default aggression.
Which that was like an absolute, when you and I were talking, was an absolute kind of like a kapow moment for me when you and I were on the phone. And I can actually, this is how like much of a explosion in my mind it was for me. I can picture exactly where I was at. You and I were on the phone. I was by the co-op feed mill in Sterling, Kansas, when you were like, you basically said, sometimes it's not our job to go home every day. Law enforcement officers and admin is say, well, we got to get everybody home safe every day. We got to get everybody home safe every day. Well, in our job, that may not actually be the goal for the day. We need to make sure that our communities make it home safe first. We are the ones that put ourselves in the way first, and we may not go home at the end of the day. And I was like, whoa, because that was a complete shift in my mindset in the sense of like, whoa, like that is what I felt my whole career. I felt that, like, I've always had that should that ever happen kind of put me in coach mentality. And I'd never considered it from even though it makes perfect sense, I just never heard it put that way before, that the community goes home first, safe, and then us. And if we can have both happen at the same time, obviously that's the goal that we want to get to. But sometimes you're the lone guy going into a room with a guy that's got an AR, and you may go down. And then maybe the next guy gets him. Maybe he goes down, but maybe the third guy gets him, and so on and so forth. So,
well, what you've described is what is called the priority of life model. So innocent citizens of the community, they're dependent on us. That's why they pay us. That's why they train us. That's why they give us all this equipment. And by the way, if we can get into the officers' inactions at this point because of what you brought up, but remember, anyone who's listening, if you're law enforcement, the first responders have the most burden to stop an incident, especially an active shooter incident. The first responders have the best opportunity to diffuse it, to contain them and eliminate the threat. So they did a good job of containing the shooter, but they failed to eliminate the threat. So let's talk about, I don't want to pile on that everybody else is hating on these guys, and I don't think these guys were really cowards. I'm going to tell you what my theory is here at the end, but I don't think these guys were cowards. So they arrived rapidly. 24 rounds were fired in this, so they were trying to figure out where he was. Again, we're in the fog of war here, right? You hear shots, it echoes between buildings. You got officers arriving at all angles. They're communicating. They're trying to figure out, where is this guy? What does he look like? Where's he right now? Meanwhile, an officer arrived at the grandma's house, and they're communicating that, hey, I got a lady shot in the face here. So there's that going on. So within 3 minutes of the suspect entering the school, 9 officers entered the school. 2 of them had rifles. And 3 of them made their way towards the threat. You've seen the video, right? So
yep.
3 of the officers.
Yep.
One of them was, his name was Javi, and he wore a white shirt. It looked like maybe he was a detective or whatever. He was on the ground for some reason. I don't know why he was on the ground, but he was on the ground for some reason. Let me describe the door. The door is a steel door, And in the middle of a door is a real narrow window. Well, this window in the door has mesh running through it, right? So it's a safety glass, and it's like a chicken wire that runs through it. So it's a safety glass that will prevent you from like breaking the glass and reaching in and opening the door. They did that probably in the case that an active shooter was outside the door, right? So it'd be hard to shoot through the door, shoot through that window, and then make their way into that classroom. So they thought that through. That's a great door. But unfortunately, law enforcement couldn't do much. What he didn't do was check the door, or if he did, he got shot. So they have all this fancy stuff protecting the classroom, except there's sheetrock as a wall. So there's just a sheetrock wall on the interior side, but on the exterior side, it's this center block style stuff that, could protect, from storms or whatever, So the outside, there's been a lot of talk about why didn't they attack from the outside? Well, the windows were 3 feet off the ground. They were relatively small windows. They were tinted windows, because down in Texas, everything's tinted because of all the sun. So you can't see inside the classroom, but you can see from inside to outside the classroom, right? But also, these teachers have shades that they've dropped in front of those windows because of, the sun bearing down all day, and then, kids not paying attention. So they had shades in front of all these windows, right?
Could that be lockdown procedure for them too, is to like close those so maybe people can't see in?
Lockdown procedure would include that, as well as shutting off the lights. And, so the lights were off in the classroom, so you can't really see in the classroom. So there's been a lot of criticism, like 2 windows per classroom on that side of the school, and you couldn't see in those windows. So let's give the officers a little bit of credit. I mean, they couldn't do much with those windows. I mean, they could have started some distractions in that area and draw fire to themselves. Or let's face it, they could have gone to the door and drew fire to themselves. They could use the door as a barricade, actually, because it was a steel door. That what they shouldn't use is probably the sheetrock.
Yeah.
Which is how,
if I had to choose between the two, it'd be the door.
Yeah, which is how the 2 officers were shot initially, anyway. They received fragments. They weren't really shot. They weren't hit with any hard rounds, and they retreated. Right? Can't really blame them. They're probably in that static mindset. Now this has gone hyper ballistic, and they're having trouble. They've never really confronted this kind of a scenario, perhaps, and they've never been shot back at, and they don't know to stay in the fight and keep shooting or find the suspect. But you also have to realize there's kids in that room, so you got to make a direct shot and be able to hit that suspect. I don't know if you're going to be able to focus too well in a situation like that where the room is darker on the inside.
Well, they also talked about how when they came into that area, there was like kind of, when you talk about the fog of war, there was a literal fog of war there, where all of the gunpowder and the smoke and everything kind of hanging in the air. I'm sure that had a little bit to do with that decision-making process before, but that's also another good question of, have they participated in force-on-force trainings? Have they had a little bit of that pain inoculation? Because I know that's something that I've put our officers in the county through. And of course, not everybody shows up, but I can't force certain agencies to be there. But is working through that pain. Just because you're shot, you're not dead.
Yeah, and you've been through my training, and I've shown you the video of the officers that were cut down in Colorado, right, in Littleton.
Yeah,
you remember that video.
Mm-hmm.
I think what that video demonstrated very clearly is, unless you have a level 3 vest or ballistic shield, it's worthless.
Right.
It cut through their vest. That 223 cut through the officer's vest like it was butter. One officer, she said she was hit 6 or 7 times, I think.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
And then the other officers, shot in the chest, and one of the officers was tragically killed. But we're placing too much emphasis on vests, I think, and ballistic shields. Now, there are level 3 vests and shields that are out there. And the college I worked for went out and invested in level 3. In other words, it can stop rifle rounds.
Yeah.
High-powered rifle rounds, right? The reason why we're talking about the officers today, because the suspect's already dead. We can talk about the suspect too, but I just want to key on some of the things that happened in there, right? So the number one problem after the suspect made it into that room, the number one problem was an officer steps out, and I think it was Sergeant Coronado. I don't know for sure, but you could hear him on the radio saying, "The shooter is barricaded in an office." That is the single most detrimental thing to that incident and to those kids. That is the person that needs to be held to the highest standard, because that changed it from dynamic to static. Because when we think office, we don't think that
active loss of life. Yeah.
And what made him say that? Why did he say that? If that was Sergeant Coronado, who I believe it was, because of the sound of the voice that I'd been hearing throughout the whole video of him, what disturbed me about him is he was hyper worried about the safety of his officers. He was continuously saying things like, "Be careful, guys, he's got a gun. Slow down, be safe in there." That is not your focus at this point when we have an active shooter, especially with kids involved and teachers. These are innocent people that deserve our protection, right? So I like to say there's a time when we stop being safe and we start being dangerous. We move to the warrior mentality. And the warriors don't think about their own safety when they're defending their fellow warriors, or they're defending an innocent village or whatever. You move into that warrior mentality and you are dangerous. You don't tell your officers, "Slow down, be careful, he's got a gun, watch the window." You don't say those kind of things in a dynamic situation. You say, "Get in there, let's get him. Where is he? Let's go, guys." Those are motivating factors, and what Sergeant Coronado was doing was demotivating factors, okay? And that's very important because he stopped the driving actions that was occurring organically or through the training of those officers, and he took it upon himself to worry about his officers. So there was a transition in thought that went from the safety of those children to, "Are my officers okay?"
I think that there's also been a little bit of a shift in training of law enforcement, and maybe you can comment to this a little more because you have significantly more experience than me, is we're kind of moving towards the whole like de-escalation. And when you talked about the house plan and the not being default aggressive, is, we're spending a lot of time focusing solely on de-escalation and not training our officers to be aggressive, because like is de-escalation this negative thing that's like there's nothing positive that can come from it? No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is there is a time to talk and there is a time to do work, and we really need to be focusing on training our officers on both sides of that dichotomy. Again, to reference Jocko in his book, if you wanted to take that even into take it from a management principle and into a law enforcement principle of, it is a dichotomy. If you have an officer that just kicks the door and guns everybody down each time, that's a problem. If you have an officer that shows up to an active shooter and wants to hand the guy a teddy bear and talk him out of the room, that's a problem. So you need to kind of find that balancing act, and that's where like good training and good leadership comes in, and also that on-scene leadership, like you talked about, is going to be an influential factor in essentially pushing people towards the goal at hand.
Yeah, we call it the guardian mindset. Like we're the guardians, we're the sheepdogs of society, so we're overseeing the flock, and most of the time we're protecting them from themselves. We're keeping them from driving too fast, or from getting in fist fights, or from battering their wives, or whatever. We're protecting them from themselves, but there's a time when we have to actually destroy them. There's a wolf that's crept in here, and we have to, that sheepdog has to become an attack mode. So, and that's what alerts training taught us. Is they taught us, that became the national standard in 2016. They taught the priority of life model that I teach in my course, and decision making in my course. And it really makes things very simple if you understand that your life is really lower on the pecking scale or priority than innocent people. Once you begin to understand the priority of life and safety, which is the National Tactical Officers Association model, they're the ones that created that. Alert just they seized on that terminology, but NTOA is the one that had been teaching that for many, many decades. So, I had been in the tactical unit and I understood it. We're officer safety when we're just going in after suspects and suspects are alone. We're all about officer safety. We're going to throw flashbangs. We're going to take it room by room. We're going to have a sniper post. We're going to take our time, right? If it's like a drug warrant or it's like a high risk search warrant, right? But when we're talking about dynamic situations, which TAC units don't train enough for, and they haven't for decades, they need to train more dynamic. I don't know about Texas, but I just mean here locally. They're more slow and methodical, and they got away from dynamics. Even in drug warrants, they're more like, let's call them out. It's not worth it for a bag of dope, So they're doing less and less dynamics, so they're less prepared for it, right? So, we need to step it up in law enforcement. We really do, because as society is getting more volatile and more dangerous, we're becoming less dangerous. We're becoming more emasculated, and we need to get the right people in the right places for those situations. We need to get people trained up, and we need to hire people who can switch effectively back and forth from guardian to warrior. We need to, and we as law enforcement, we need to get in shape. I mean, I'm an example of that. Of course, I'm 58 now, but we need to be able to make good decisions at the end of a run with our rifles and our vest on. We need to be able to be clear-headed instead of say stupid things like he's contained, he's barricaded in an office. Well, that's because of the fog of war and probably adrenaline, but also because you can't breathe in that moment and you're not making clear decisions, So I think we as cops, we need to step it up a lot, like 1,000%, and get back in shape. But our communities need to support that effort. Mm-hmm. So what we don't see is the communities, so law enforcement, we've talked about the mental health problems in law enforcement because of constant overexposure. So law enforcement needs to be mentally, physically, and spiritually fit to make good decisions and to be healthy, right? But we don't see that. We don't see really, if we're going to, okay, I know I'm bouncing around here, but if we are going to cause reform in law enforcement, those are the trinity that we need to focus on, is the officer's mental, physical, and spiritual health need to be in tandem, right? And we need to allow officers time to work out on duty. If that's a priority and we don't want officers to eat jelly donuts, then we need to make healthy food available for them throughout their day on duty, especially these guys working 10 or 12-hour days. Well, what are they doing? They're drinking coffee. They're eating jelly donuts. They're eating a lot of sugar to stay awake.
It's just quick and easy on the go most of the time for you guys.
Yeah, that's what I find is it's just easy to, it's easy to go to Casey's where this pre-made thing is made because I've got like another call. I'm just going to grab that, snack on it on the way to the call, and then boom, move on with my day.
And I was the same way. I work midnight. I understand. But we are a joke. We really are. We're kidding ourselves if we think that we're the warriors out here saving people. We're not. We're a joke.
Well, I think that we proved that.
Shape, man.
We proved that.
Well, I would say, in my case, anyway, if I had to run 100 yards and then make a shooting decision, I'm not ready. I need to get back in shape, and I just wish the community would if they want to reform law enforcement, the community would support that and say, hey, we want you guys in shape, so we're going to give you time to get in shape on duty. I
know Sterling, they the city pays for the memberships at the gym for them, but it's not like you don't get paid to go work out.
Actually, we do. We could choose to go to the gym during work. I've done it several times, especially when I'm doing like wheat harvest, and I'm doing wheat harvest, and then I come to work and I work and then I sleep, and so I can go to the gym. I would say that if I were doing it every day as like a general rule, it would probably be frowned upon overall. But going in there once in a while would not be frowned upon.
There'd be people bitching at you on the Sterling Bulletin about, we're paying this guy to work out.
Exactly.
Well, that's the thing. There's always going to be backlash when you do something positive for law enforcement. And I can tell you, we had a chief that was a runner, and he was a marathoner. He was an Ironman. And he encouraged us to get on board with that. And so we did. I'd shed 45 pounds, and I was running marathons. I ran 7 half marathons, and I didn't start running until I was in my mid-40s. And, I got laughed at, like, oh, look at you, brown noser. I'm like, no, this is a healthy decision, a choice I'm making. This man did inspire me. He gave me some things to read that clicked, and I got in a weight loss program. I got my weight down. I started running, and I never felt so good. I could whip my 2 teenage boys in wrestling in my living room every night because I could breathe again, but I was 185 pounds, and I think they were 185 and 200, but I was throwing them all around the living room. They were high school wrestlers and football players. But I had that old man strength, they called it, where I knew leverages and different things.
Amen. There's a little bit too that just the experience of the world.
Pressure points, play just a little, flirt that line, playing dirty.
Hey man, pressure. Hey man, if you ain't fighting dirty, you ain't winning. All right.
So we're kind of all over the map here. I just kind of want to close this out a little bit about before you start in on what you want to talk about as far as this goes, but. The biggest problem was they said the shooter barricaded in an office, but they still had shots fired. That should have been their stimulus to move, according to alert training. My understanding is they all had it, but they didn't have a bias towards action at that time because it had gone static. If it was barricaded in an office, why would you? Why would you attack that, right? Well, there's no office in that whole building, and somebody should have spoke up. Somebody who worked there. How about the chief?
Yeah, or one of the officers that knew the building intimately. Like one of the ISD officers.
The chief was in the building. He knew that wasn't an office that guy was contained in. The officers outside, they didn't know. The officers from outside agencies, they didn't know. They thought this guy had contained himself in an office. What's the hurry? Let's slow it down. That's logical, right? Well, that wasn't the case. And there were some key people there that knew that could have changed the scenario. And what they didn't do was create the urgency to get in there. And kids bled to death and died. Now, according to my nephew, those kids that were dead were shot unrecognizable. They had used DNA to identify them. If that tells you how horrific the crime scene was. I have a feeling that he also may have run out of ammo or had come down to hardly anything because he dropped his grab bag somewhere out in the parking lot. And he had, 30 more magazines or more loaded with, 30 or 40 rounds. I don't know.
I think that's another interesting point because the shooting at the Heston, the guy, why am I drawing a blank? At the lawnmower place there. Starts with an E. I can't remember. Anyway.
Oh, Mountain Ridge.
Yeah. So that officer, I was asking him. I was like, hey, the chief there, who's now in charge of KC Post. I said, hey, was there a piece of equipment or a piece of information or something that was missing that you wished you'd had post incident? That looking back, I wish I had this. And he talked about those go bags. He's like, those go bags, we were given those go bags with like medical supplies and ammo and all that other kind of stuff, but we never trained with it. And he said, so when I got out of the car, I didn't get out of the car with the bag. And he's like, and it was worthless in my car because we'd never trained with it. And I was like, aha. So I wonder if that's some of it, because I will tell you, and granted, I'm used to wearing a vest and a belt and all that, so I'm used to having some things that are cumbersome. But trying to run with that bag on is a pain in the butt because it wants to flop all over the place. And then I could see somebody, because most of these people that go into school shootings, they're mentally weak people. I could see them going like, that's uncomfortable. I don't like it. I'm just going to drop it, be done with it. Again, making vast inferences here. But I could just see that being the thought process. Or I know the heat's on, and like cops are here, and so I want to run faster. I want to get to my goal. I want to get my anger out. And like that was kind of the focus. So maybe that was probably a good thing that he hadn't trained with that.
Yeah. But in this case, we're talking about the suspect dropped his grab bag.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I was talking about the suspect dropping his grab bag.
Was that a known thing?
Because it was so heavy?
Yeah. That it was cumbersome to run with it and keep it and hold it. And, if you had 30 mags worth of ammo in there, that thing ain't light. That is not a light bag.
Was that a known thing to the guys in the building that he didn't have much ammo?
No, I don't think that's even a known thing to me. I'm just supposing that. So he had some kind of shirt or vest on that. He shot 100 rounds in that classroom. And the lion's share of those rounds were fired before the officers arrived. So I think that there had only been 11 shots fired after the officers arrived. So that's a different mindset. And then after the other officers were surrounding the building, I think we have an additional 4 shots that were fired. So it really, in their minds, really did slow down to a trickle. Like, okay, he's still a threat, but more to himself than us. I don't think that they knew that he was in a classroom. Most of the officers, in fact, that's what my nephew said, is that the officers outside thought that he was in an office. So I don't think that the officers around there understood that he was in a classroom. Now, this is interesting. About 4 or 5 minutes after the incident started, one of the officers showed up and said, my wife's in there and she's hurt. She told me she's hurt. And they disarmed him and they ushered him out. She was one of the 2 female teachers that died. She was still alive when they got her out of the classroom. She died at the hospital or on the way. And he was trying to drive the action when he showed up, and they didn't listen to him. They restrained him. There were parents that showed up that they restrained, that wanted to get in there. There were mama bears that actually got their kids out from another classroom because they weren't going to listen to law enforcement. And that's not a precedent we want to set. And I want to tell you, this bothers me because outside of the George Floyd video, this is the most devastating video, an indictment against law enforcement, modern law enforcement. In our time, I've never seen anything that's more devastating to the reputation of law enforcement. Because George Floyd, we look like brutes. Now we look like cowards.
Amen.
And that's unacceptable, because that is not what I've learned about law enforcement since I've been a cop. And that's not what I see. That's not what I train. The officers are not cowards by any means. And I don't believe that the officers in that hallway were cowards. I think the initial responders flubbed it and maybe didn't have the training or didn't do what they were trained to do. But everyone who's arriving after, man, they're manned up. They're ready to go in there. They're cowboyed up and ready to take care of business, and they're being restrained by the chief. And that's an interesting fact. The chief gets on the radio and says, keep everybody out of here. We're waiting on the SWAT team.
And keys and other shields and all that good stuff too.
Yes. Okay, so here's my question. You're one of the officers in the hallway. What are you going to do? Now that you arrive late, you're officer number 9 that gets in that hallway. You got a chief over here who's saying, hold the male, don't go anywhere. He's contained, he's barricaded. All the officers are being looked down upon as though they failed to act.
Well, if we're talking like I don't have the benefit of hindsight in this situation, obviously, is if I'm officer number 9, I'm going to trust that the previous 8 officers, especially the commander, knows what's going on. And he knows that, even though it may be erroneous, that he knows that this person's in an office, that there's no active loss of life, that we're barricading. You know, because I even, as I'm reading the report, I'm thinking, okay, if you were in that mindset, like let's say that's the situation, you can maybe start evacuating other parts of the school, whatever other tasks it is that you decide that you're going to complete. So as officer number 9, I am going to trust the other 8 officers that I've trained with, that I've put my life on the line with, and that are in the shit with me right now. And I'm going to say, okay. And I'm just going to sit there and I'm going to wait until I'm told to do otherwise. Again, without the benefit of hindsight in this situation.
Okay. Let's say you're the chief and you have integrity and you have the wherewithal to know that the action needs to drive forward, especially after as many shots have been fired that you're aware of. 24 shots were fired outside. So they knew this guy was shooting. They knew there were kids in that building, and they knew he'd barricaded. Let's say you were a chief who actually would admit that he's in a classroom with other kids. Before there was 40 minutes into the scenario where the girl was dialing 911 and talking to a 911 operator 40 minutes after it started. You're in the hallway. How are you going to get in that classroom? What are your thoughts?
Did they try to evacuate kids out of like the adjoining classrooms, ones that were like right next door? Not adjoining, but
they actually broke windows and got them out from outside instead of going down the hallway and getting them out.
Okay.
They didn't want to expose them to dangers, and the teachers knew not to open the windows. That was part of the training. So they had to go window by window, break the windows out, and pull the kids out one by one.
So, I mean, are we talking overall tactics, or are we talking tactics in reference to my specific school? Because I don't exactly know what the windows and things look like. I know you talked about the safety windows outside the classroom, but...
Well, the windows are probably 2 feet by 4 feet. They slide up and down.
Okay.
So, no, they're a little over 2 feet wide.
I think I would be a little hesitant to talk tactics in this situation on a public forum for my specific school, because I've got some ideas of how I would breach that room, but I don't want anybody that would want to use this to try to plan to hurt kids. So I probably won't speak that. But I mean, I don't know what else. I don't have the SWAT and experience and things like that. So I would probably rely on, like, for instance, there's an officer in our county named Cameron Beakley that he has the tactical training. He has that tactical expertise. And if he were on scene, I would default, hey, what do you think? We need to get into this room. Like, get me a game plan. Like, I don't care how it gets done. Get in that room and neutralize this guy, kind of thing. We've got active loss of life. Let's figure it out. Because, you know, obviously my mind goes then to like, okay, safety glass. Well, you could explosive breach the room, but then you've got kids inside, you know, so, you know, all those things run through my mind. I'd probably have to default to someone else of like, because in that moment, you're going to have to take a few minutes. And of course, I'm not going to be in the hallway. I learned that valuable lesson from Derek Ploutz in our last shooting. He definitely took a step back in the last officer involved shooting, or the officer involved shooting we had with the sheriff and undersheriff, where he realized I'm the only administrator that is not boots on the ground. Okay.
Here's the exterior window.
Okay, so he's showing us a picture on Google Meet right now. It's kind of like your typical what you would see in a window of a house, but there's like 4 different panes, and each pane is probably like how wide would those typically be?
There's 2.
Oh, there's 2? Okay.
It just opens that way. So
so they like slide down and slide in?
Yeah, slide down and up and down.
Well, and those probably are only a couple of panes worth of glass. You know, I mean, you could break and rake that probably. That doesn't look like safety glass. I don't see anything that's running through there.
That was at the door. This is what I was talking about, the door.
Yeah, okay. So that's a significantly smaller window. Yeah, so obviously your best bet's going to be trying to hit from the outside to try to get to the inside.
Well, alerts made several tactical assessments, and they made several suggestions. One of them was, why don't you go in room 112? And they were adjoining rooms, so if you could get in room 112, even if you had to beat through the sheetrock to get in there, get in there. Another suggestion they made was, hey, draw fire to you at the door and try to figure out where the fire's coming from and return fire from the glass. And yeah, you might get hit, you might get killed, but it's just going to be another 10 soldiers stepping up and taking over where you fell down. We're going to drag you out. You're hit. We're going to drag you out. Somebody else is going to step up. And now if he's being counterattacked, let's say from room 112 and the window outside, so my point is that chief could have developed an ad hoc plan. He knew those schools better than anybody. And he was taking precedence over the sergeant who was on the scene, who I think the sergeant really wanted to get in there, even though he was telling everybody, hey, be careful, he's got a gun and all that stuff, which isn't the time to say that. That's my opinion. I mean, I have officers that I work with that disagree with that wholeheartedly, and I want to put that out there, that they think that, yes, do be careful, but also be dangerous. And I'm not saying don't duck if you're being shot at. I'm saying, take the fight to him.
Yeah,
and
right.
Draw the fire to you. That's your job. Priority of life says that officers' lives come before the suspect's life, but which we call the actor, the active shooter, but they're subordinate to innocent people. And that's what we get trained to do. That's what we get paid for. I always say when people ask me, why do you make so much money? I said, well, it's not, what'd you do today? And I said, well, it's not what I did today. It's what I'm willing to do. Lay down my life for a total stranger. That's what I'm willing to do. And, I would hope and like to think that my training would kick in and it would be automated. But that's why you got to keep training too. So I also want to say this about the chief. There appears to be an air of arrogance about him as I watch him on there, and that's why I suspect he didn't attend the training. And so when you meet up with a narcissist who is in charge, right? This guy doesn't want to be trained because he knows it all, right? So, and I've worked for people like this, and it's in our industry. It's in every industry. A lot of time your most dangerous people are at the top because they know it all, right? Which means they're unteachable. And I really think that some of these guys come in thinking they know it all because they've done so much in their careers. They don't realize that it's a constantly evolving trade where we have to keep learning. We have to keep getting better. We can't rely on and rest our laurels on what we've done in the past.
I would argue that's any industry and anywhere really. Once you get complacent, you fall behind in any trade, whether that's working construction or being a football coach or being a cop. You get complacent, you fall behind. So you constantly got to be learning.
Absolutely. In fact, I played high school football, and I went back and coached junior high football in the early 2000s, and they were beyond what I knew in high school.
Nothing like me. I can't teach you anything.
No, could you please teach me what you already know? I mean, I'm serious. Because Little League football wasn't a thing when I was a kid. I didn't hit football until I was in junior high. So these kids were learning what I learned in high school, in junior high, and before junior high. They were learning it in Little League. So, yeah. And I've got to say that these kids that are going to be active shooters are beyond what law enforcement is learning, because they're on these simulators all night long and they're playing these games all night long. Now, I'm not saying every kid that plays a game is an active shooter someday. I'm saying every active shooter is going to play those games because they're going to learn from those games how to defeat law enforcement.
They are getting more and more realistic. especially when it comes to technology and training, and like even games now, like you can start shooting through walls. That's not something that like I played a video game that you could shoot through the walls, so to me that was something that I had thought of, or shooting through windows in video games and stuff. Like some officers you see at training, they will not engage people through windows. It's almost like it's that the old adage of like, you're worried about the kid, you being a kid, and you're going to get in trouble for breaking the window, and you're going to have to pay for it to be fixed, kind of thing. And so there is something to that, of like, because any more realistically, like look at Rainbow Six Siege, like all the tech that you get to use in that game to tactically maneuver through, to put like the robots into the rooms, to look around, to gather the intel. How do I ingress? How do I egress? How do I create? Yeah, how do I? The portholes. How do I create a distraction? You name it. There's something to that. I agree, and I like how you also said, I'm not saying everybody that plays these games are going to be active killers, but there is something to that. I mean, it is a training simulator. I mean, hell, we went through at least I went through that in the training academy. We played a literal video game for use of force, so it has training techniques.
So the biggest failure occurred with the first responders by not driving the action beyond what Have did when he got fragments in the head, and then they stopped. Well, your job is to stop the killing and then stop the dying. So if the guy even quits shooting, there's kids in that room that are dying. You got to get in there. And they could hear the screams. We've been prevented from hearing all that. They haven't let us hear the video. So how in God's name do you hear those kids in there screaming for their lives and him shooting them? How in God's name do you stay in that hallway? So those initial first responders should be held to the highest standard, and then as well as the chief. And I'm going to propose that they should even be indicted. I think that they should be prosecuted for failure to act. They had a duty, in my opinion, to act in that situation to prevent loss of life. Now, we don't hold, according to the Supreme Court, officers to individual protection of citizens. But when you're at a mass shooting situation like that, you have the vest, you have the weapon, you have the training, you have to go. There's no, should I go? Should I stay? No, it's you have to go. You have a moral obligation to step it up and get in there.
Yeah, that should I stay or should I go should have been a conversation you had with yourself many, many, many moons prior to ever wanting to strap all of that stuff on.
At the very least, they need to surrender their badges. I have no problem saying that. But I'm going to put myself out there and say they need to be indicted for the outcomes. I mean, to me, their negligence resulted in the deaths, even though they weren't the ones causing the death. They allowed it to happen. So this is no different than letting a drunk driver get behind the wheel and then go down the highway and careen into another car. You had an obligation to stop him, to protect the lives of others. And I'm going to say that they failed. And the chief, he ought to serve the longest time, because he was the common denominator in the outcome of this. I mean,
he was the main failure point, really.
Yes. But those first responders had the most information. They never corrected it. They never corrected the misinformation. I'm sorry.
If you don't hold guys accountable like when they mess up like this, then who's to say the next time it's not different? People aren't gonna see this and like, oh, okay, well they get away with that, so why can't we? It's not gonna set the precedent for future incidents moving forward.
And I'm sorry if there's officers listening that think that that's too harsh or I've gone too far with that. I'm sorry they feel that way, but I felt that way in the George Floyd situation immediately after seeing that video, that officer needs to be indicted. Not necessarily the officers around him. I didn't feel like they should have been, because they were in training, but this guy was a veteran, and he should have been indicted for that. I always felt that way about Chauvin. And I was getting poo-pooed for that too, for saying that, but he ended up indicted. So, and he's serving time. So, but now, you guys want to talk any more about the scene there, or do you want to move on to talk about what's driving these mass shootings?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have some follow-up questions, I guess, on some of that, and some follow-up comments on some of the things that you've talked about up to this point, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
So one of the things you talked about was admin as a house plant, and how they're not dynamic decision makers, or they're not dynamic in the field, or they're not in the field. So I had a friend of mine who I would consider someone that I look up to as a mentor for my job and just life in general, not just being a law enforcement officer. But
I'm listening. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. He told me that that one of the things that since I'm interested in running for public office, was he said, if you think you're going to be a working sheriff, and if you think that you're going to be out on the street, like, you're sorely mistaken. Because that's one of the things that even I noticed was that some of the admin that I had, and not all of them, like, some of them have been great, some of them have been active, but some of them weren't. And I noticed that kind of atrophy, essentially, in the same way you'd see a muscle atrophy. And so I wanted, what I'm asking you is how do you combat becoming an admin houseplant? Because it is a dichotomy. If you show up to calls, your officers are going to think like, oh, what did I do wrong? Blah, blah, blah. Like, so do you just get out there and stop cars? Do you get out? I mean, like, what like, how do you, obviously you can go to things like alert training, but training can only go so far. So how do you combat becoming admin as a houseplant?
Well, I'm speaking from becoming a houseplant. It happened to me when I was a major. So the first scenario I told you about with the officer that I gave him the green light, told him to take the guy out. I was a captain, and I was a working captain on night response. So I was out making calls. But right before I got promoted to captain, I was a detective in the fugitive apprehension unit, where I was out, snagging guys and chasing guys and kicking in doors. And so I was default aggressive, right? So it was easy for me to move to action. I had a bias towards action. When I became a major, my duties changed. As the leader of a unit of more than 90 people, you're overseeing everything. You can't be all places at all times, so you do a lot of shit from your desk, right? And I would get several hundred emails a day, and it was difficult to keep up on my emails, man. Writing policies, creating units, creating new enforcement actions, use of force reports I was reviewing and signing off on, and things like that. So, I thought about your question even before we got on here today. I had a situation when I was a major where I was called out to go to a scene. They were getting ready to take down some drive-by shooters. They had spotted the car. We had surveillance set up on these drive-by shooters. They had done a drive-by at a house. We were expecting them to go back. The feds were up on these guys. They were listening to their phone calls. They even knew which house they were going to hit. So our job was to take these guys down. Well, my colonel calls me and says, get out there and make sure this doesn't get screwed up. So-and-so is one of our officers who's out there, and he's aggressive, and he's going to end up causing this to be a shitstorm, right? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I kind of said.
You're fine. You were good.
Okay. So what do you think that the colonel sent me out there to do?
Micromanage?
Mitigate risk.
Okay.
He didn't want to get sued. He didn't want the police department to get sued. So where do you think my mindset is at? I've been in bed for over an hour, and he wakes me up and says, get your ass out there. That's my mindset. Well, I get there, I get briefed. The officer in question is already out in the field. He's setting off the car, right? They end up following this guy. This guy was a car. There's 4 guys in the car. They were armed. They had rifles. They were headed to do the drive-by. Our undercovers start following this car. The car takes off from them, thinking they're being, chased. We end up boxing them in about 3 miles away. They start ramming our cars. I show up with my pretty Commander SUV. I don't want to be a part of that box in, so I stay out in the street where I could observe everything, but not necessarily get involved in the action, Next thing I know, one of Missouri officers starts shooting. They launched a flashbang at the car. The flashbang goes off, and then that triggers a bunch of shooting. I had 2 captains at the scene. They're standing up shooting into the car too. So I'm watching this, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what in the hell is going on? And one of the guys, a driver, was a passenger on the rear passenger, crawls out of the car and crawls across the street on his belly, and they take him into custody. But there's 3 people shot in that car. So I bring my captain over. I set him down in the car. I get out of my car and I'm asking, what happened here? And I asked my captain, what in the hell? I thought it was a contagion, where one guy shoots and then you have a sympathetic reaction and everybody starts shooting. That's what it seemed like, a firing line. And we had probably 10 or 12 officers there that were, I don't know how many shot into the car. I can't remember. It was 5 or 6. And I thought, not only are we getting sued, there's going to be some officers indicted over this, Well, what happened was I brought my captain, set him down in the car, and said, what in the hell did you do? Why were you involved in that? Why were you shooting it? He goes, man, the dude had a rifle and he was pulling it out. You didn't see it? I said, no. He goes, man, I'm standing right there on the other side of your car and I've got my rifle aimed at him. They throw the flashbang. The guy jerks the rifle up out of the window, and that's when I shot him. So we had 3 suspects shot. They're all headed to the hospital. They all survived. They were not mortal wounds. They were flesh wounds or leg wounds or whatever, and they all survived. And I felt like I failed to command that situation. But I let the sergeant, at least I had enough sense to let Sergeant Greenwell run it. I mean, during the incident, I didn't interfere. And then even after the incident, he had Missouri officers from, his specialized unit that were over there that were involved in the shooting. And then I had my captains that were involved in the shooting. And then I had to call the colonel. And I don't know if I was incoherent when I called him or what, but he sent me every major that we had on the police department. And they came out there. They more or less relieved me of duty, and they took over the scene. And I felt humiliated. But Nick, it's not that I couldn't make a decision. It's that I couldn't clearly see what was going on. I couldn't clearly see the need to shoot those guys. And I was a little bit disturbed by what my understanding of what I was seeing. I would have underreacted. Well, all of those guys were primed to act. They were ready and primed and willing to get aggressive at the least sign of any kind of resistance or hesitation from these guys, because these guys had already done a drive-by shooting. They were headed to do another one. I just woke up and I was an ass plant, and I wasn't default aggressive anymore. It was in my history. But see, I had gotten to the point to where I wasn't a part of the SWAT training. I wasn't out on their operations anymore. Now, the next day we had a big staff meeting, and I got raked through the coals. I had to sit there in front of the colonel and in front of every major on the police department and explain to them why things turned out the way they did. Now, they were all, nobody was reprimanded. They were all cleared of everything. And I was too, by the way. But at the same time, I wasn't used to dynamic decision making. I'd been a commander for 14 years, but I'd been a major going on 4 years. This was one of the last dynamic situations I was involved in as a police officer before I retired. And I didn't have a bias towards action anymore. And, that's not easy for me to admit, but I think it's helpful if there's anyone listening that is in those situations, whether they're in the military or whether they're in law enforcement, to admit to yourself that, hey, man, I'm not out there every day making decisions like I need to be. I'm not put in those situations anymore. You've got to let the people, the frontline supervisors, make those decisions. And then you can evaluate it afterwards, because guess what? You're not in the mix anymore.
So you got to train them the way they need to be trained, and then you got to decentralize command.
Yes. That's exactly what Jocko talks about. Mm-hmm. You got to train your troops and then step back and let them make the decisions.
So speaking from small law enforcement agency where, as you don't have every major in the department and multiple sergeants and all this other kind of stuff. You might have a sergeant, and that's pretty much your only first line supervisor. So how would you, because the reason I'm asking is because I want to know from me to get my mind rolling. How would you keep to make sure that you as a sheriff or administrator stay in, at least kind of help keep that default aggressive? Now, not to say that you're standing in the middle of the hallway of the active shooter, but like that way when you do go to make the decisions, you're helping make the decisions for the betterment of your community going home safe, and then also your officers going home safe. So do you choose every Wednesday you go out and you run traffic, or you're going to be out on the street, or an hour a day I'm going to just say enough with the emails and I'm going to go out and I'm going to patrol? Or like what do you see as a way to kind of help combat? Because again, training's important. Like attending like an alert training or bringing those things to your community and training on that is good. But actually getting out, putting hands on and doing things, which, obviously I understand that a sheriff or a chief is not going to pick up a, $50,000 financial crimes case that's going to take 9 months to investigate. But at least getting out there and engaging with the community, still talking to people and staying sharp.
Well, two things I would do in your scenario if you were going to be the sheriff. I have downtime as a campus police officer, so I choose to use my downtime watching YouTube. And a lot of what I do is I watch podcasts. I either listen to things like Jocko Willink, or I'll watch some of these videos of armed robberies and how they end, and I'll listen to the commentaries, and then I'll send those to the other officers. And the reason why is I want to keep fresh, because this may happen. I may need my weapon someday, and I want to think it through. Your body can't do what your mind hasn't already thought through. It's not a reflex to pull your gun out and shoot somebody. That is training. So you are training your mind by watching those videos. The other thing I would do, especially if I was a sheriff, like you want to be, is ride with some of the other jurisdictions. Just do ride-alongs. We had chiefs that would do ride-alongs, and they would pick a different area every month, and they would go out. And we had one chief that made all his commanders go out and ride once a month. They had to pick one shift a month on midnights or evenings, and they had to go out and had to spend 8 hours with an officer, not a sergeant, but an officer. And they loved it. They thought it was great, and it reconnected them to their roots.
How did the line officers see that?
They thought it was great.
Okay. I just figured that they would see that as so they're riding with their own officers, or they're riding with officers from other jurisdictions?
No, it was their own officers.
Okay, so because I just could see sometimes of like I could see the fifth quarter talking of, well, they're watching us, or they're trying to see if we're going to screw. I could see that being some of the mentality
maybe at first
received. Yeah.
But after a while, they accepted it, and they were actually honored that they were the one that was picked to do the ride along with. And again, some commanders didn't like doing it, so they'd get out of it, or they'd only ride a couple hours, and then they would check out. But for the most part, most of the commanders enjoyed it. Once they got plugged in and they looked forward to it. It was the feedback that I was getting.
So since we're on the subject of how do you combat things, you talked about being combat ready, essentially, and staying sharp. So you have those obviously retired on duty officers that you get. How do you help to motivate them? Because you've got guys that have been in it for 25, 30 years, and they're basically in coast mode. They'll show up for the annual qualifications. They'll show up for the in-services because they're told to be there, or because it's overtime. But essentially they've become the house plant, but they aren't even in admin. How do you combat or help motivate those individuals?
You don't.
I figured that was
how much
be the
time
answer.
are we talking? If these guys are near retirement, why would you want to motivate them to go out and do anything? They just need to maintain their duties, as far as if something bad happens, they need to be there and they need to take part of it. But you don't want to really encourage a guy who's near retirement to go out and get motivated and start writing tickets.
Yeah, right.
That
I understand. If you're getting ready to turn in your retirement papers, but I'm talking guys that are maybe halfway through, that are just kind of, they're dealing with some of that secondary traumatic stress and things like that, and they are retired on duty. They're just coasting through and just wanting to get through the day.
Well, okay, now there's two types. There's types that are beginning to burn out, but the reputation is that they were a worker. And now they're going through a lag time. Well, so I went through that several times in my career. I wasn't lazy, but I had certain things that had happened to me and throughout my career to where I'm just shutting down. There's nothing you're going to do to make me work if I don't want to, because I'm just shutting down for a while. One of the times was when my brother got fired. My brother got fired for a traumatic accident that he was involved in. He got his job back, but once we realized that, our administration didn't have our back, you're not going to blast me out of my chair. So there was a lag time there where I was burned out, and you didn't want me and my attitude out there doing things at the moment. Now I did the necessary things that, I was supposed to be doing. I showed up to work. I answered my calls. I was thorough. But as far as self-initiated, forget it. I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't in the right mindset. So I'm just being frank. I think every 7 years an officer goes through that. About every 7 years.
I would agree with that. I've been there before myself.
That was told to me when I came on. You're gonna be married to the job. It's gonna be your mistress. Be careful of that, because she will not love you back. So don't love your job. Your job will not love you back. But you're gonna do it anyway, and you're gonna go out there and you're gonna live and breathe this stuff. And then in about year 7, you're gonna realize, oh man, she's cheating on me. She doesn't love me. And then you're gonna get disenfranchised. Your infatuation wears off. The honeymoon's over. And now you hate this bitch. And that's going to last until you move into another area. And that's what my father taught me was, if you don't want to get burned out, keep moving. Do other things. Learn new things. And that'll keep it fresh. And that's what I did. So I divorced the department in the sense that it no longer became my mistress. This was child support. So even though it was still my calling to support this child, It was no longer an infatuation. It wasn't. I didn't live and breathe it anymore. It was. I became more balanced, Nick, and that balance was, my faith, my children, and my hobbies were all as equally as important as my job. And then I became a better cop. I had more common sense after that. And I approached things like from the perspective of the common man. I wasn't just living and breathing, being a cop, being a hotshot cop.
So that's really good. I like that. And I can also relate to some of that because my priorities have changed when it comes to, going to church and hanging out with the family. And if that's playing video games with the kids because that's what they want to do, or, just got done taking a trip with my wife to Illinois that I got back from yesterday, and things that early in my career, I would have been like, nah, I got to go to work. Nah, I got to go to work. Nah, I got to go to work. Like that. That was like my main focus of like, I'm going to go out and I'm going to like, because it was fun. It's so much fun, and it still is. And it's so easy to get wrapped up in that. And it's the analogy you gave is so incredibly accurate. I'd never heard it that way before, but it's so incredibly accurate. So I appreciate that. So back to the leadership early on, you talked about casting a vision and then thinking ahead of time. I wanted to give an example of how this worked, of something that I've seen in the casting the vision and thinking ahead of time. Was we recently switched over to an 800 megahertz radio system. And I say recently, I think it's been a year or two, something like that. And the gentlemen that put that together, that were basically kind of spearheading that, was the communications director, Josh Michaelis, and the emergency management director at the time, Greg Klein, who's now the emergency services director. And they had the forethought, and also, people, they surrounded themselves with people that knew this too, where when we were setting this radio system up, they brought in what's called a COW, which is communication on wheels. So essentially, if you have a major incident happen, like a tornado destroys your radio infrastructure, they would bring this trailer in and they put an antenna in the air. Boom! Now you have communications again. So they brought that in and took all of us officers and gave us 800 megahertz radios and said, all right, go throughout the community, go into houses, go into schools, go into the fire department, which is a big metal building, go into all these places, and here's a piece of paper, and now say you're gonna key the radio, and first of all, were you able to connect, yes or no? And if you were able to connect, like, what would you rate the sound quality when you received a reply? And then also, what was the building made of? Was it metal? Was it brick? Was it sheetrock? What was the makeup of it? And as a result of all that work, because at first everybody was like, oh gosh, this is so stupid. Why do we got to do this? This doesn't make sense. And like, this is a waste of my time, which I was nerding out because it was new tech. And I was like, hell yeah, sign me up. But because of that, my radio only doesn't work in a few places. Like, there's no perfect radio system, right? And you know that as well as I do. And so they casted a vision. They stuck with it, even though they kind of got some flack for it. And they were thinking ahead of time. And we're able to, like, so I can communicate inside of my schools with my radio because we planned how the towers were placed in the county through that. So I just wanted to kind of circle back to that, about casting the vision and thinking ahead of time. And let's face it, it's technology, and there's weather and all that, and who knows, maybe there's a critical incident there sometime and the radios don't work well. But another thing that was like, okay, use runners, talk to people, have them run out to the command post and relay a message. And I was like, okay, duh, simple but effective is one thing they talked about in the Uvalde report. So I think there's a lot of really great things that have been said today, and especially when it comes to like the leadership and like what happened there and what we can do better. And I think there's a lot of things that, if you're listening to the podcast, and I don't care if you're an officer that you have been on the street for a week, or if you're that commander that's been doing the job for 25, 30 years, it doesn't matter where you're at in an organization. You can be a leader. You can cast that vision. You can think ahead of time. You can also even change, because if you're a rural law enforcement officer, you're going to hear Bill say things like, move in the department, go to things like SWAT and detective and blah, 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 where you're thinking, okay, like my department, I don't have any of that. But you know what I did was I was like, DRE, that sounds cool to me. I'm going to go do that. That was like another thing. Hey, being a precision rifle marksman, that sounds cool to me. That's like something new. I'm going to go do that, keeping in mind I had to pay for the precision rifle marksman stuff myself. But I kept that stuff going. And where there's a will, there's a way, and you can keep that stuff going. You can keep yourself motivated. I don't think that it rests solely on your leadership in your law enforcement agency to basically pat your butt through your career and to make you stay motivated and all that other kind of stuff. There is some accountability there.
And this stuff doesn't just apply to law enforcement officers.
Amen.
You know,
I was gonna go to business after this.
It works for everybody, you know, in all stages of companies and stuff. Like even in construction, you know, there's all sorts of different trades within construction. And for me, like I want to be challenged. Like if I'm just doing trim every freaking day, I'm gonna get so bored and burnt out. I'm gonna go find something else to do. You know, with my company, luckily there's enough things to do different that like I stay challenged most of the time. And like when you move up and out, and then you also have to get hands off and decentralize a little bit, and you've got to give, and if you're more in a superintendent position, you know, you're hands off. Like you're not swinging a hammer every day. You're gonna let your guys that are on the ground, boots on the ground every day, are going to be the ones making the decisions on how to do these remodels and builds. And because if you're telling them what to do, they're going to feel micromanaged, and you don't want them to feel that way.
Well, and also I think some of the ways is like they kind of had the expertise and the knowledge and the boots on the ground, because sometimes the angles and the measurements and all that stuff don't quite add up. Mm-hmm. So in your line of work, for instance, if you try to come in and tell them like this is what you need to do, well, it's like, okay, we can't do that because this is how this works. And so
I mean, you
just
get
trusting them to do their job so that they don't have to ask for essentially like permission to fire, right, Bill?
Yeah.
Right.
Because you get asked plants and construction and like every aspect of business. So,
well, I have to pick up my son from my mother-in-law. She is persistent that I have to come get him. So I think we should look at maybe trying to wrap this up. And I think we could continue to even go further, because I know you mentioned like, okay, now we can start to even mention why are these things happening, and then we can also even start mentioning into
that could be another podcast.
Yeah, no kidding, exactly.
Probably will.
You know,
yeah, we should.
If you're not in tune with your own thoughts on God and stuff, you're not going to want to tune into that, because I have some thoughts on where this is going in our country and why we're here. So maybe that's another podcast. But hey, I do want to say thanks for giving me the opportunity to express my thoughts on this. I really feel like not enough has been said to those parents that had to endure this national tragedy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't know what it was like locally for them, but like the first few weeks you heard about it every day, and then after that it was just nothing.
I apologize to them if anyone's listening to this that's from there. I apologize for the lack of efficiency in law enforcement, and it's our bad. We should have been in there. That was a horrible outcome. That we don't train for things to happen like that, and I guarantee you, like 95% of those officers that were there didn't understand what was actually occurring. Most of those shots were fired before they got there. I guarantee you that they feel horrible for you. And we all signed on for this. And, you know, they're going to take their lumps. But the guys that made the decision, you know, who knew kids were in there, the guys that made the decision purposely not to go in there or misrepresent what was going on, they've got to live with that decision. And I assure you, they will be having nightmares the rest of their lives. Hopefully they'll get right with God and then get right with you guys the best that they can. But I feel horrible for you, and I feel horrible for those kids. And this is a black eye on the face of law enforcement that we will never get rid of. This goes beyond a black eye. This is more like an orbital socket break that has deformed our appearance in law enforcement. And just try to remember that anyone listening to this, that this does not represent the heart of law enforcement. Think about this. Doggone it. That guy found the one door that was open to that school. There was no other doors open. He happened to luck out and find the one door. And then he found the one door that wouldn't lock. I mean, that doesn't happen normally. I mean, that is evil incarnate, the walking into that school, doing what he did. And it's just represents where our country's going with lawlessness. And that's another podcast, but my heart goes out to those families and those poor children. I pray for those families.
Amen. And, if you're also some sort of a person that's tied into the schools, there's a lot from that Uvalde report that can be learned from the school perspective as well, which, again, shout out I have to give to Jim Garacki, because our superintendent has definitely stepped up to the plate on that. And
since then.
He is basically, he told us, he said, if there are any doors on our schools propped open at any time, you let me know and I will go back and look at the camera footage and that person will be disciplined. Period. End of story.
Felicia got yelled at the other day.
Yeah, that's where that came from. Yeah. And when we hop off here, I don't want to, there's a part about that, the security side of the schools that I wanted to tell you about that I don't want to discuss on the podcast. So with that being said, any final thoughts there? I think you kind of closed it up. Anything else, Bill?
Nothing from me. Just thank God that, I got a chance to talk to you guys, Nick and Nate, and this was another excellent adventure with you guys. Thank you.
Yep. Well, we appreciate you coming on, and we know that, although this was a tragedy, that guys like you are doing the right thing, and we're learning from it, and we're going to use this to better our education in law enforcement, so that things like this doesn't happen and so lives are saved.
Thank you. Good to hear from you, Nate.
Yep. You too.
You do the outro, buddy?
Yep. Guys, thanks for listening to Higher Points. Had another great conversation with Bill Howard, and I think there's going to be more to come. So stay tuned for some of those. Go like us on our Instagram and Facebook and leave us a review. Want you guys to go out and have a good week and just go make the world a better place.
Hey, thanks, guys. Thanks, Bill.